Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to remarkable people about the big ideas in their lives, how they see the world, and the events that have helped shape them. And my guest today is a really extraordinary author, Malorie Blackman. She's been the Children's Laureate. Her series, the Noughts and Crosses novels, are required reading for young people up and down the country. And she has just brought out a new one in the series called Crossfire. And Malorie, you're very straightforward. When you open the jacket, you say on the first page that you've written this in response to what's happened here and in America since 2016.
Indeed. In fact, the whole series was inspired by sort of current events. Noughts and Crosses, the first one, was inspired by, particularly inspired by the Stephen Lawrence case. I was watching a docudrama which showed just how the Lawrence family had been treated by the police, and I was so angry. And I'd been criticised up until then for not writing about racism, as if, as a black author, that's the only thing I can write about. But I remember watching that and I thought, OK, now I'm going to write about racism. I felt ready to do it then. And it wasn't just about, it was kind of like, that was the impetus for me sitting down and doing it. And I remember sort of, it was channeling that anger. It was kind of like, OK, I'm going to write about racism, what it's like to be on the receiving end. But before that, when I was playing around with the ideas of, well, now, how can I do this? How can I actually address this subject, but in a way that would be accessible, that teens in particular would want to read without kind of banging them on the head with a message. Because I remember as a teen hating books that I felt were trying to preach at me. So I passed some ideas by my friends. I thought, should I write about slavery? Should I write about the legacy of racism? And they were kind of like, oh God, don't write about racism because it's so painful. And what do you want to write about that for? Because it was so long ago and so on. And I thought, isn't this fascinating? Because people are sort of like, it's not like they already have read the book. I haven't written a word, and everyone was assuming they knew what was going to be in the book. So I thought, well, how can I do this so that I'm playing with people's sort of assumptions as to what the story is going to be about? And that's how Noughts and Crosses was born, because in the book, the minority and the ones who are kind of seen as second-class citizens are noughts, who are white, and the crosses are kind of like the status quo works for them. So very few of them have an interest in changing that. And the crosses are black, and it's set in sort of alternate Britain. And it's basically about the friendship and the relationship between Callum, who's a nought, and Seffi, who's a cross. So that was the impetus for it. And it was also bringing in a lot of my own childhood into it, a lot of things that happened to me as a teen in particular. A lot of things that happened to me, I put in the book, and they happened to Callum. So things like, I remember asking my history teacher, I said to her, why don't we ever talk about black scientists and achievers and inventors? And she said, because there aren't any, Laurie. And I remember kind of looking at her thinking, well, that can't be right. I'm sure there must be some. But, we hadn't been taught any. I had never come across any books that sort of, non-fiction books that spoke about black achievers and inventors. And it was only when I was in my 20s and I found the Black Bookshop in Islington, and I could actually educate myself. And so that's a conversation that I had, that I put in the book, that Callum has, and says, why don't we ever talk about any nought scientists and inventors? And for example, there's a scene in Noughts and Crosses where Callum is on a train, and travelling first class with Seffi, and the ticket inspector accuses him of stealing his first class ticket, which is absolutely based on what happened to me the first time I travelled first class on a train when I was 17. And the ticket inspector stood there and insisted I must have stolen my ticket, and it was absolutely mortifying. But again, it was something I put in the book. And so what was interesting to me was I thought there was a lot of stuff I had dealt with, but I hadn't. I realised I just buried it when I wrote the book, but it was my way of kind of just letting it go, kind of writing it out and letting it go. And so Crossfire is the fifth in that series, and it was inspired by kind of Brexit and Trump.
This is a political story, isn't it?
It's a very political story, but it's not about them. It was inspired by them, but it's about a man called Toby who is desperate to rise to the top as a politician. He wants the top job, being the Prime Minister, and he doesn't care who he has to walk over and what lies he has to tell to get there.
How much of you is in this book, though? Because you're married to a nought, in your terms.
Yeah.
A white man.
Yeah.
And you've got mixed heritage children.
Yes.
So how much of those experiences and perceptions are written in?
I think in Noughts and Crosses, there's more of Callum's character. Of all the characters I've written, I think Callum's character is probably closest to my own. And before, when people said, "Are you in any of your books?" I'd always say, "No, all my characters are made up." But Callum's character is definitely closest to my own. And I do wonder, in fact, if I would have even written Noughts and Crosses if I hadn't met and kind of married my hubby. But that said, the rest is kind of made up. Obviously, it's things in my own life and conversations I have with friends and so forth. And I think, I'm going to put that in there. Some bits of my life are in there. Like, I remember in Checkmate, there's a bit where Seffi is walking with her daughter, Callie Rose, and she walks past two crosses and they see that her daughter is biracial and call her a slag. And that absolutely happened to me. I was going into Tesco's with my daughter and two black guys walked past me, saw my daughter and looked at me and said, and one of them said, "You slag." And Lizzie was kind of just chatting away. And this is when she was like 6 or 7. And I was so angry. And I wanted to turn around and just give him a mouthful, but then Lizzie would get upset and, I thought, okay, let it go, rise above it. But I was so angry. But then I thought my way of kind of dealing with that was to put it in the book. So there's lots of things that kind of happened to me that, there might be the odd bit that I've put in the books. But of all of them, I think Callum's experience, especially when he's at school and when he's growing up, not when he becomes a terrorist, I hasten to add, but when he's growing up and so forth, a lot of that stuff is based on true stuff that happened to me.
How much do you think the context has changed, though, of Britain and racism since you wrote the first Noughts and Crosses by comparison to now?
Well, that's an interesting question because in Crossfire, the fact that Toby is a Nought, and there's much made of the fact that he was the first Nought mayor of Meadowview, and he's going to be and if he wins the election, he's going to be the first Nought Prime Minister. And so when I first wrote Noughts and Crosses, that wouldn't have happened. A Nought being up for the sort of top job wouldn't have happened. So times have moved on.
This was pre-Obama. It was
exactly.
Any people with the top jobs.
In my book, it was sort of it came out in 2001, but in the world it's set in, that wouldn't have happened, and Nought wouldn't have been able to rise that high. So in Crossfire, absolutely, he gets that top job, but then he sort of it sort of lands in his lap briefly because then he's sort of arrested and charged with murder. So then he's sort of like he's got to sort that out. But definitely things have moved on in that those top jobs and those jobs are kind of more accessible to Noughts. But that said, the racism in that world is still going on. It's supposed to be a reflection of what's going on now, where we've had a rise in hate crimes and sort of rhetoric from the top. It is sort of people, they use these euphemisms, racially charged and racially infused. I read that one and I thought, seriously? Racially infused? When it's actually racist. Let's just call it what it is. It's racist.
You mean like the Trump tweets?
Yes, exactly. Saying, those 4 women should go back to where they came from when they're American citizens. And it's, it's the usual nonsense I had when I was a child, when I'd be told, "I'll go back to where you came from." And I'd say, "Well, that's Clapham, actually." So it's sort of like, but recently it's kind of like that seems to have come up again. It's sort of like, I feel like I've gone through the looking glass and I'm back in the 70s almost.
I mean, it's interesting you just bring up that sort of go back to where you come from, because I had the same thing. People would say go back to where you come from, and I'd say, what, Liverpool?
Yeah.
But actually, would you give the same answer now? Because I'm not sure I would, because I think, I sort of slightly feel it's more important to recognise origin and heritage than you do defensively when you're the victim of a racist slur.
I mean, if I was
would you say Barbados or
no? I wouldn't, because my heritage would be Bajan, and I'm proud of it. But that said, I was born here. I see myself as kind of African Caribbean British, and I'm not going to deny one over the other. My heritage is British, but I was born here. So if I was having a conversation and so on, then we could go into the nuances of these things. But if someone's just spouting racist nonsense at me, I'm just going to say, actually, I was born here. So deal with it.
But I suppose also what I mean is 2001, Britain was in a sort of a progressive upswing in terms of social attitudes.
Yes.
Whether it was on race or sexuality or whatever it might be. Things were changing. So that was the context of writing it then.
That's exactly.
And the context now is, as you say, that perhaps there's more diversity you can point to at the top, but it's gone hand in hand with this rise in more overt racism.
Yes, yeah.
Why do you think that's happened? Why are the two? Is one a reaction to the other? Or?
I think it is, and I think what it is maybe there's a fear of people who in some quarters of people feeling that they're losing their place in the world, losing their status in the world. It's like almost like feeling the more rights that people of colour get, somehow the less rights maybe white people are getting, which is nonsense. But it kind of feels to me like maybe that's the feeling, and I think also. It doesn't help when you get rhetoric from the sort of so-called politicians, etc., setting that tone. The go back home buses and or the van that was going around, and people like Trump with his rhetoric. And what gets me is I believe what Maya Angelou says: when people show you who they are, believe them. And Donald Trump has always shown us who he is. And when he was first voted in, and I had friends saying, "Oh, but maybe now he's in top office, he will do better. He'll have people around him to temper what he's saying, and whatever." And I thought, what load of nonsense! Of course, all it's going to do is amplify what he is, which is the case. And it just strikes me as kind of that whole anti-immigrant rhetoric, which I think. The powers that be have done such a slick job of convincing people that all their problems stem from immigration. It's like every time I get in a taxi, I have this argument with sort of taxi drivers, if they're sort of white taxi drivers, where the last time I was in a taxi by myself, I got into a real argument with the taxi driver because he was saying, "Oh, I voted for Brexit and there's far too many immigrants over here and you can't even get council houses and whatever, and that's all Tony Blair's fault." And I said, "Well, hang on." I said, Margaret Thatcher was the one who brought in selling social housing, and instead of having a policy of for everyone that was sold, they should build another one. It was just, sell them. So if you're going to blame anyone, you need to blame Margaret Thatcher. And it was, well, no, it was Tony Blair. And at the end of a sort of 70-minute journey, because it was taking me from North London to South London where I live, and we were kind of, we weren't screaming at each other, but we were definitely having a debate. And at the end of it, I thought, you know what, I'm not going to convince you. You're so convinced that immigrants are the cause of your problems because you've bought into this rhetoric. So instead of and it's this whole thing of the government or saying, well, you can't get a school place, too many immigrants. You can't, and the media as well. Some parts of the media reinforcing that idea, which is it's nonsense. But I think people have bought into it.
Well, then that gets to the heart of what your books are about, really, which is about making people see things from the other.
Yes,
side,
exactly.
And changing their minds that way, I suppose. If you can't change them in an argument,
yes,
in the back of a cab.
I hope what I'm doing is I'm raising topics for discussion and debate. I'm not telling anyone how to think. I wouldn't dream of doing that. But I hope what I'm doing is having characters who are living their lives, and you can kind of see what they're going through, and maybe it gives you a kind of better understanding of what other people who have a different experience to you, who might be a different religion or a different ethnicity or be more physically challenged or whatever, or a different sexual orientation, what they're going through, so that it just broadens your horizons, it broadens your gaze. And
are you really not telling people what to think, though? I mean, is there enough ambiguity in your books for people to have any other conclusions?
Well, I hope. I mean, what I do is I'm presenting my characters in certain scenarios. They're going through some stuff, obviously, but I hope what I'm doing is saying, this is what they're going through. What do you think of that? What do you make of this? So how would you handle it if you were going through a similar? In the same way that Callum, as a Nought in Noughts and Crosses, goes through an awful lot because of the colour of his skin. But again, in these books, especially in the first one, I was very careful to not mention colour. I caught in Noughts and Crosses, especially, it was Noughts and Crosses, or the derogatory terms for them were daggers and blankers, which meant that I got an awful lot of sort of letters and emails and things from around the world. For example, from Ireland, where they're saying, "Oh, you're talking about Catholics and Protestants, aren't you?" Or I had letters from Israel saying, "You're talking about the situation between Israelis and Palestinians, aren't you?" Which I love, because it means then people can refer it back to their own lives. And so I would hope what I'm doing is saying, this is their life, this is what they're doing. Then make up your own mind about whether you agree with what they're doing or what's going on or the society they live in. And so I do hope I'm raising things for discussion and debate. I hope I'm not I'm trying not to tell people how to think. I wouldn't do that. But it's kind of presenting their lives, and you kind of read them and make up your own minds about whether their actions are right or wrong.
You said before you started Noughts and Crosses you hadn't written about race.
Well, I hadn't overtly written about it. Even having children on the cover, black children on the cover, was a political statement, especially when I started writing. I remember sort of like being invited into to see an editor, and they were kind of shocked when they saw that I was a black writer. And they said, "Oh, we really like your story, but would you mind if we made your characters..." Well, first they said, "Well, how do you see your characters?" And I said, "Black." And then they said, "Well, would you mind if we made your characters Asian?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean by Asian? Do you mean Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi? Are you talking Chinese, Japanese, Malaysian? What do you mean by Asian?" So it kind of went very quiet. And then she said to me, "Well, okay, well, we just thought it'd be kind of like we'd reach a bigger audience that way." And she said, and also we already have a book that features a black family. And I said, "Well, how many books do you have that feature white families?" And then it went very quiet. So I sort of came out of the meeting thinking, okay, well, that's not going to happen. But in all fairness, she did write to me and say, "Well, look, we feel we'd be doing you a disservice if we didn't do it the way you wanted, so we're going to publish it as a black family." But I thought,
So they did. That was the publisher.
So they
yes.
did.
What do you think they meant? I mean, do you think they meant there are literally more Asian people in Britain than black? Or that there is more empathy for Asians than black people?
Well, I think maybe it was a bit of colorism going on where they felt sort of a lighter skin would reach a wider audience. I mean, this was sort of like, this was, 15 years ago, so this was quite a while ago. But it was fascinating to me that that was a conversation I was having. It's one of these things where, going back to sort of like the books before Noughts and Crosses, featuring black families in my books was a political statement. Writing a book like Pig Heart Boy, where it wasn't about race, but it was about a boy facing his own mortality and needing a heart transplant, was a political statement. Children who are kind of in fantasy stories or mysteries or whatever was a political statement.
So do you feel those books were about the black British experience?
Yes, absolutely. Because what also annoyed me when I started writing was when I was talking about the dearth of books that feature that black British experience, I was told, "Oh, but we've got African-American books," which is not to do down the African-American books. Absolutely. And I lived on those, but it's a different experience. It's not the same as a black British experience. And they're not interchangeable. And I thought, well, no, they're not the same. And I was born here, and I want to write ostensibly for myself, but also for all children, but feature that black British experience, because it's not the same as the African-American one. And that was really important to me.
Where did that come from then? Because when did you start writing?
Well, I mean, I started writing when I was 8 or 9. I wrote for my own amusement. It never occurred to me I could be a published writer. It was just never one of those things that was presented as a career, and certainly not to black children. And I remember...
Well, that's quite unusual, isn't it? So what was childhood like?
Well, it was full of books. I lived in down my local library, so I was very lucky. I lived sort of equidistant between Deptford and Lewisham libraries, so practically every Saturday would find me at one or the other. Couldn't afford to buy books. I didn't actually go into a bookshop until I was 14, when I had my first Saturday job and could then finally go and buy books for myself. But I absolutely lived in my local library. And my mum took me when I was very young, and she took me sort of 3 or 4 times. And then after that, I'd say, "Oh, I'm going to the library now," and I'd make myself a packed lunch and just spend all day in my local library and reading as many books as I could. And then when they were chucking people out, I'd take out as many books as I could on my ticket and try and make them last for the following Saturday. And I did that for years.
So what did you love when you were young?
I loved the chalet stories. I loved myths and legends. I loved fairy stories. Basically, I just read anything and everything I could get my hands on. But in all that time, I didn't read a single book that featured a black child like me. Not one.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. And were you conscious of that? Because I don't think as a young child I was ever conscious that I was reading about people who were nothing like me.
I was.
And it was probably only Orwell, when I was about 11 or 12, that I suddenly thought, "Oh, I can get this now." But you were aware of that, were you?
I was, absolutely.
There was nothing that was like you.
I mean, it's one of these things where the beauty of any book is you think yourself into it. You can see yourself in that scenario. You become the character. But I was very aware that even the descriptions of the characters with their white skins, or they went pale or whatever, and I was thinking, this isn't written for someone of my skin complexion. So I was very aware that, of all the books, like the Narnia books and so forth, which I absolutely devoured and loved most of them, but they were very much white children. There were no children of colour in them. In a way, it made me feel almost like I was invisible, like my experiences, my life wasn't worthy of being documented in a book because I just wasn't there. And the first time I read a black character was in Othello, and that was one of my A-level texts, and that was when I was 17. But the first time I read a novel that featured a black character was The Colour Purple by Alice Walker, and that was when I was 21, 22. And that's a hell of an age to get to before you actually see yourself in the literature you're reading. There's a bit of me that still feels sad for the child in me that never got to see myself in any of the books I was reading. And so I sort of fell into computer programming, but in my mid-20s I thought, when I was looking around for something more creative and fulfilling to do, and I thought, well, actually, I want to write for children, and I want to write all the books I would have loved to have read as a child, but they just weren't available.
And what do you think the effect is on children who read books in which they don't see themselves? Is there a more profound effect, do you think?
I think there is. Seeing yourself validates your experience, and I think, in a way, it says that you're not worthy of having your stories told. Which is why it really annoys me when I sometimes get the criticism, oh, well, you know, your stories, it's kind of about political correctness. If people of colour get published, it's about political correctness. And I just think that's so insulting, because that's saying that my stories and my life and the stories of any person of colour, the only reason they're being done is for the sake of political correctness. And I just think, no, our stories are worthy of telling. And I think what's happened recently is the success of films like Hidden Figures and the Black Panther, etc., have shown that there's an audience for that. And I remember when I started writing, and I'd go into, and I made sure I accepted practically every school visit that I was invited to do. I would go up and down the country. I was two, 3 times a week sometimes. I would go into schools up and down the country. And I remember going into certain places, and I remember one librarian in particular, and she said, well, don't expect to sell too many books, because this is the retired colonel and lady set, she said. And we had about 150 books, and I was talking to years 5 and 6 in this particular school. And my view has always been, if you engage children with the story, if you engage anyone with the story, they won't care about the colour of the protagonist. They'll just want to engage with the story. But it's so important that everyone sees that that book should be not just windows onto another world, but they should be mirrors as well. So I remember sort of doing my talk and talking about the stories and so forth. And then at the end, we were selling the books and we sold out. And I remember signing the books and kind of giving this woman the side eye thinking, I hope you're watching this, because when you say that no, children aren't going to be interested in the books, or, you know, this is the retired colonel and lady set, so, you know, you don't expect to sell too many. That's kind of your view. That's not the view of the children and the teens. And that's another reason why I wanted to write for children and teens, because I thought if I can get past the gatekeepers and get directly to the children, then I'm sure I can engage them in the stories I want to tell.
You're making the world of publishing sound awful.
No, I don't mean to. It's
closeted, you know.
No, it's had its challenges, and I mean, this was the librarian, a school librarian. This wasn't sort of publishing, but that said, I've had editors who've absolutely been behind me 100%, who've wanted to really facilitate what I wanted to do, who've helped me do that. So I don't want to make it seem like every editor I've had has been an absolute nightmare, because it wouldn't be true.
But you've never had a black editor, have you?
I've had one,
right,
Verna
okay.
Wilkins from Tamarind Books. I've had just the one.
Has that made a difference? Because we're recording this the day after Toni Morrison died, who obviously famously worked as an editor as well as a lecturer and novelist. Did it make any difference?
It made a difference in that sometimes I had to explain things that I thought were kind of obvious, but they were obvious if you were black, or they were obvious if you were a person of colour. So sometimes, and certain ways of saying things, certain things I had to kind of explain, no, this is valid in this context. That said, when my really good editors have kind of taken that on board and said, OK, that's fine, you know, because they know it's outside of their experience, so they trust me on that.
Do you think if you're trying to reach a wider audience,
yes,
do you have to sort of de-black it at all in terms of language and culture, or do you stick with it and just expect people to learn it? It's
a bit of both. I don't de-black it at all. I mean, I am who I am, and I'm going to write. I can only write the way I write. So as far as I'm concerned, I've read, you know, if I read Dostoevsky or I read sort of other writers, they don't kind of move away from their cultures or whatever. That's who they are, and you embrace that when you're reading the book, because that's what you're reading for, surely, to kind of open up your world gaze. So I don't de-black it as such. It's very much from a black experience, but there isn't the black experience. It's kind of like just as many black experiences as white experiences, as Asian experiences, or whatever. So there's no one story.
Why have you chosen your audiences the way you have? Because you pitch your books really at particular age groups, don't you?
Well,
because in between the Noughts and Crosses books, you tend to do younger children's books.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it depends. It's really about what ideas I get and what ideas I get that I want to turn into stories, and what age they're appropriate for. But what I love about writing for children, and especially writing for young adults, is you can present these ideas and you can present like the politics behind things, and they're absolutely engaged with that. And I think a lot of people say, oh, but our teen's going to be interested in politics. Maybe not so much party politics, but absolutely politics. And I very much, I remember when I was a teen being very engaged in politics, because I had to be. It was around the time the National Front were marching where I lived and so on. So you were having to deal with this. You had no choice. And now I think people like Greta Thunberg, who's about climate change and speaking up for we have to do something about the climate change. Teens are absolutely standing up and making their voices heard, and I think all power to them. And my daughter's generation are very, very political and very kind of like getting out there and kind of marching and making their voices heard in a way that I feel it took me too long to feel I had a voice of my own.
People often say, we're not born with prejudice. The prejudice is taught to us. Do you think that's really true? I mean, isn't prejudice born out of survival and competition?
I think bigotry is taught. I think the view that your life is somehow, or you are somehow superior to another section of society is taught. So yeah, I think the natural competition in between, sort of like, it can be a healthy thing, but in the context of bigotry and prejudice, no. And I think that has to be taught. And I think the idea, I don't think children are colourblind, but they see colour, and it's not a thing for them until it's made a thing, or somebody makes it a thing for them. As I said, part of the reason I'm writing is to try and counteract what maybe some children are being told at home, and say, no, here's another view. Here is the life of someone, and you don't need to be afraid of this person. This is their life, and understand their life, and so on. So I kind of think bigotry and prejudice are things that are taught, and we have to come up with ways of counteracting that. And one of the ways is through books.
How do you think we keep young people reading, rather than the inevitable or traditional teenage drop-off, particularly with boys?
I think there needs to be more emphasis on reading for pleasure. I think there needs to be more of a, if you're into comics, they're not saying that's rubbish and being sort of snobby about it. It's about saying, if you're into comics, let's give you some really good graphic novels. Just engaging children with reading for pleasure first, and then all that other stuff can come about, kind of the sentence structures and what a difference between an adverb and an adjective and so forth concerned. But you've got to get children reading for pleasure, and part of the way of doing that, I think, in schools is to have times where children can just read for themselves, where they're being read to, particularly in infant and primary schools, so they get a love of story.
And do you think, I mean, you worked in IT.
Yes.
Do you think video games are the enemy?
Oh, gosh, no. What a load of rubbish.
As a parent, I do.
I don't. I really don't, because I love my computer games anyway, so I'm not going to say that computer games are the enemy. But my thing would be, if someone's playing computer games all day, every day, and nothing else, then I would, as a parent, I would start to worry. But it's about all things in moderation. And if someone's into computer games, I would try and find a game where there was reading involved, like World of Warcraft, for example. So if you take on a task, you have to read about it and find out what the parameters of it are and what you need to do. And as someone who plays World of Warcraft, there's a lot of reading involved. I mean, I'm there with my warlock and I'm throwing my shadow bolts at kind of dinosaurs and dragons and all the rest of it, but you're still reading. So if you've got someone like that, try and investigate games that involve reading. Try and get children involved in that way.
How did you get the first deal?
I wrote sort of 8 or 9 books, and I was sending them out, and they all got rejected, and so it was kind of like over 2 years and 82 rejection letters later that a publisher finally said yes, and that was the women's press, who are now defunct, unfortunately. But what the counterintuitive thing is, I used to send my work out to the bigger publishers because I thought if it's a bigger publisher, they're more likely to take a chance on a new author. But it's not. The smaller publishers were more likely to do that, and it took me a while to kind of learn that, because the smaller publishers were more willing to take a chance on an unknown voice and a black voice, and so the women's press were the ones who kind of published my first book.
Do you think that's still the case?
It might still be the case in that smaller publishers are more flexible about kind of what they take on. A lot of big publishers won't even accept things unless they come via an agent. I didn't get an agent until I had my 3rd book published. So, so I languished on the slush pile for a couple of years. But that said, I think all publishers are still on the lookout for the next thing or new voices. I think a lot of publishers now are talking about, they know they have to be more inclusive in their publishing, because now we live in an age where if they're not, they're going to become obsolete, because there are other ways of doing it. It's easier than ever now to self-publish. In the same way, I mean, I look at people like Stormzy, for example. Stormzy did his own thing musically. He didn't sign up with a record label. He did his own thing. Now he's got record labels clamoring to sign him. But instead of waiting for the gatekeepers to go and open a door for you, go and make your own door. Do it yourself. And so I think now, I wouldn't have waited until a publisher said yes. I wouldn't have got to 82 rejection letters, because I would have self-published.
You've had lots of honours along the way as well, haven't you? I mean, I was part of the panel that made you Children's Laureate.
Yes, I remember.
A few years ago, which was very exciting. But you've also got an OBE.
Indeed, yeah.
How do you feel about having an honour with the word empire in it?
Yeah, that word is unfortunate. But at the same time, I think it was one of those things where I thought, it's a shame it's called what it is, but I took it as an acknowledgement of kind of the work I had tried to do up until that date. The word, I must admit, did make me uncomfortable. So I did have to struggle with myself as to whether or not I would kind of take the award. And in the end, I did. But I think the name of it is kind of unfortunate in that, because empire means different things to different people. And for me, it means that my grandparents and so forth were subjected to kind of a lot of racism, where my ancestors were dragged over from Africa to Barbados and treated like less than animals and so forth. And so it has unfortunate connotations. But in that instance, I thought, I was kind of weighing up the pros and the cons, and I thought, okay, I will take this. But my mum's thing was, if you don't, I'll kick your ass, kind of thing. Excuse my French. But, so it was sort of like, so my mum and my husband and my daughter went with me to Buckingham Palace, and then I got the award. And my mum she's so lovely, but she tells it how it is. I mean, she doesn't muck about. And I remember we all went for a meal afterwards, and she was kind of looking at me, and I was saying, you're all right, mum, you're all right, mum. And she just looked at me and she said, I am so proud of you. And it was kind of like, and she'd never said that before. And I just thought, oh, well, thanks, mum. It was just so lovely.
Because was your mother Windrush generation?
Yeah, she was. She came over in 1960.
And so how have you seen that scandal unfold from your point of view?
That's something that has, again, made me really angry. Where my mum has been here over 60 years. And the fact that people of her generation can be deported if they don't have the necessary documentation. They've been here, they've paid taxes here, and suddenly it's like you're not British. You don't belong here. And there but for the grace of God goes my mum. There but for the grace of God could go my sister, because she was born in Barbados but came over here when she was 10. So, it just makes me really angry that people who consider this country their country and so on, and have lived here, paid taxes here, have worked. My mum's thing was that she was never going to claim the dole. She was going to work. Even if she had to sweep the streets, she was going to work. And now to sort of like at this late stage to be told, well, but this is not your country and we can kind of deport you. When in fact it was the government who got rid of a lot of these boarding passes and so forth. They got rid of them instead of kind of storing them or putting them on computers or whatever. And then to turn around and say, now prove that you belong here. I just think is outrageous.
Why do you think it happened?
Well, Theresa May said she was going to, that we're going to have a hostile environment. And I think some officials in the Home Office took her at her word. And her rhetoric was also, we deport now and hear the appeals afterwards. And that's what happened. And so, and this is why this whole thing of people need to lead from the top. They have to set an example. These people kind of have to be very careful what they say, because words matter, words count, and people will take you at your word. And that's why when people like Boris Johnson call people like me pickaninnies with watermelon smiles, and I'm supposed to laugh that off as it's banter or whatever, I don't think it's banter, and I don't find it remotely funny.
Can you forgive that it was a long time ago?
Yes, but he came out with the thing about Muslim women looking like letterboxes last year. So, it's as I said, we all kind of say things that we regret and things that we kind of move on from. And as Muhammad Ali said, a person who is the same at 50 as they were at 20 has just wasted the last 30 years of their life. And I absolutely agree with that. I think there is capacity for change in everybody. But when people come out with that kind of rhetoric and it's sort of recent, I have to wonder, well, have you really changed your views? Because to actually say, Muslim women look like bank robbers or they look like letterboxes or whatever, I just think that's just outrageous. And I think it's unfortunate, because then there was Muslim women are now being targeted by some people, and that's why I think I was reading something that said that the hate crimes up to March 2018 over that year had increased by 17%, and in the last 5 years, the hate crimes in this country have increased by 127% in the last 5 years. And I think rhetoric like that does not help.
People often dismiss those sorts of statistics because they say, it's about reported crime, and people complain more now, and, in the way that they didn't in the past. But what is striking? I mean, what I find striking as a parent, is that the stuff we had to put up with as kids and laugh along with, and say, I know you're not racist, really. I thought had gone.
Yes, so
but it hasn't.
Yeah.
And you discover that as a parent when you see your children going through the same stuff.
I think I sort of said this before, but I think maybe we just got too complacent because we thought it was over, and it seems like what it was maybe it was just buried. I think unfortunately what's happened, I think, is a lot of people feel that their voices have not been listened to and their voices have not been heard, and nobody's addressing their concerns in terms of how they're living, so council houses and education and so forth. And so you've had other people who fill that gap, who fill that void, blaming it on immigrants and saying your problems all stem from immigrants, etc. And nobody else has been there to give account of you. And so that vacuum has been filled with hate and people trying to be divisive. And unfortunately, now we're sort of reaping the repercussions of that. And that just kind of makes me sad, because I really thought we'd seen the back of this, and we obviously haven't. So it's something that needs to be, again, challenged and addressed. But I don't, I'm not saying every person who voted for Brexit is a racist. That's nonsense. Of course, but every person who voted for Brexit isn't a racist. But I do feel that, most racists probably voted for Brexit. And I do feel that the reason a number of people voted for Brexit is because they feel they're not being listened to by the government and so forth. And their needs and their concerns, etc., have not been addressed and not been listened to. And maybe what we need is a really thorough shake-up of how things work and how governments are elected and so forth. And maybe we're in that process of, and unfortunately, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, and so we're in this state of flux and turmoil, etc. But maybe something good will come out of it. I have to hope that something good will come out of it.
But how blunt do you think we need to be about calling things what they are? So take Trump. We have no problem saying those tweets were racist. We have a problem
I don't,
with saying Trump is racist. There's a leap there.
Yeah.
What Boris Johnson wrote about Muslim women was anti-Muslim.
Yes.
Is Boris Johnson anti-Muslim? That's a leap, isn't it?
It is, and I hesitate to label anybody in that way, but I do feel, as I said, that when people show you who they are, you've got to believe them. And, you know, with Trump and the whole thing about the Central Park 5, and he was saying that they were guilty, and then it was shown that they weren't guilty, and he still insists, well, you know, but he still he won't apologise. He still insists that, and when he was selling houses, and he had a deliberate policy of, if you were black or a black couple trying to buy one of his apartments, they'd put a C next to your name, so they for C for coloured, and you wouldn't get one of his houses and so forth. And this is all documented. And so, you know, when people say, oh, you know, that this is why I hate this euphemistic language of racially infused or whatever, because at some point you have to come out and say what these things are. And then you can start to kind of address them and tackle them.
So do you think we have a racist Prime Minister?
I hope not. I don't know. I mean, from his rhetoric, I don't think he is as enlightened as he might be. I really don't know. But from his rhetoric, I would say someone needs to sit him down and give him some lessons on kind of diversity and inclusivity and so forth. I think his rhetoric is unfortunate.
With Turkish ancestry.
Indeed, yeah.
Who called for an amnesty on immigrants.
Mm.
You know, can you be a racist if you're all that as well?
There's no kind of like, you go this far and you're not a racist, and then you go over that line and you are a racist. You can have, like, for example, you can have Indian people who are who feel that black people are less than them. You can have black people who don't want anything to do with white people and so forth. So there's bigotry and prejudice in every society. But it's kind of the rhetoric you use when you're in public office, and also your actions that you have to be judged upon. And I think, you know, as I said, we all come out with stuff that we look back on and are not proud of, but it's how we conduct ourselves moving forward on that one. So I would hesitate to call him a racist, but I do feel he needs to kind of be very careful on how he talks about particular subjects, because his words have an effect. And I think all politicians and people in that kind of position have to realise that their words have an effect. And they might see it as banter or kind of playing to a particular demographic or whatever. But there are people out there who are then going to take it that next stage. And as we saw with Joe Cox and so forth, where I could walk down the street and someone doesn't like the colour of my skin, and I could find myself kind of being beaten up or whatever, you know, so that these things have consequences. Just last week, my mum said to me, God, I've just been reading some of your tweets. Could you not be so political? Because you never know, someone could come up to you and try and hurt you. And she was absolutely serious. And I thought, but I said to her, Mum, I can't live my life like that. You know, I can't live my life sort of being afraid to speak up against things that I think are wrong, because I'm afraid someone is going to come up to me and try and harm me. But it is a legitimate concern, and I do think if you are in that kind of position, you have to be careful about what you say. That is your responsibility.
Is that your number one concern?
It's not. It's one of my concerns, definitely. I think my concern is politics should be about bringing people together. It should be about making the lives of everybody better, and it should be about embracing the country we are, which is multicultural, which is kind of diverse, and it's about being inclusive of that. And it just hurts when I see kind of people being almost deliberately divisive. And I just feel that there are other ways to kind of get what you want rather than playing that particular card. And I do find it sad, because it makes me worry about when my daughter goes out and so forth. I think, are you going to be safe? Is going to be some racist nut who's going to try something? So it does make me worry for my daughter more than it did kind of 5-10 years ago. I mean, I've been in the supermarket. I've had people, it's these little microaggressions. It's people like banging into me deliberately, and things that I've had to put up with as a child and a teenager, where people would walk into me deliberately or elbow me or push me off the pavement into the road. Suddenly it's some people banging into me in the supermarket and going, give me a look like kind of like, you got something to say about that or whatever. And more people saying, go back to where you came from and so forth. And that's back. And, I did say kind of, I've heard more racism directed at me and friends of mine in the last 3 years than I've heard in the last 30. And that kind of makes me sad. And that's why I do feel politicians, etc., do have to have a duty to kind of just not pander to that kind of sentiment.
You've given us quite a lot of ways to change the world, but if you could just wave a magic wand, what would you change?
I think what I would do is I would wave my magic wand, and I would have a library at the end of every street. And in this library, it would have classics, old books, new books, graphic novels, comics, whatever. It would also have computers. It would have artworks. It would have DVDs. It would have CDs. It would have music. It would have you'd have access to kind of streaming the stuff as well. So just having that accessible to everybody who wanted to use it and who needed to use it and so on. Because I think that would be a really good start in promoting empathy for people and and libraries is not just about that, but libraries are a really good way of bringing communities together. And the amount of conversations I've struck up with people in libraries where you talk about a book you're reading or recommending a book, oh, I've read that, you want to read that, and talking about it. And I just think, they are such brilliant community hubs that we are losing.
Because people might say, well, the modern day library is your smartphone. It's all there.
Yeah, but this presupposes that you can afford a smartphone in the first place, that you can afford the broadband or the internet in the first place. A lot of people can't. And for a lot of people, the way they get on, to use a computer, they have to go to their local library. And okay, some classics might be free, but if you want the modern day books, you have to pay for them. And not everybody can afford that. And so I think that this is where I feel there's a danger of people being left behind in this, because the assumption that, everyone's got a smartphone, so what's the problem? I think, well, no, because you can't get modern books that way unless you can afford to buy them. And I really do feel they are community hubs, and we are losing that. We're losing that sense of community because places like that are going. And I think librarians are so devalued and undervalued, where it's just, we need to make some cuts, let's get rid of the librarians, where it was librarians kind of steering me towards kind of different books and saying, try this and try that, and not being knowledgeable about kind of non-fiction and being able to help you use a computer if you need to and so on. And I think they are absolutely undervalued, and we need school librarians and we need school libraries, and I think we're losing all of that, and we're losing ways of promoting empathy for not just adults but for children if we get rid of our libraries. And and if I could have a side wish, I think it would be have more teachers and have more people who are kind of trying to do things and promote reading and care for our children and our teens. And a number of my friends who are teachers have had enough and they're looking for other jobs or going or retiring early and so forth. And I think that we are losing so much expertise and goodwill out there because people have just had enough.
Malorie Blackman, thank you very much indeed for
My
sharing
pleasure.
your ways to change the world. I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, then please give us a rating and a review so other people can find the podcast. All of these interviews are available to view on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Our producer is Sarah Goff. Until next time, bye-bye.